10 Scary True Camping Stories. Story number 1, The Cry of the Lost One. The mountains were eerily still, save for the faint whisper of wind against the towering trees. A small group of campers had ventured into the wilderness, drawn by the allure of the untouched beauty of the forest. They had chosen a quiet spot near an old, forgotten trail, far from the bustling world. As dusk settled in, they pitched their tents and built a fire, unaware of the darkness that would soon descend upon them. The evening was calm, the air crisp, with the shadows of the towering trees stretching far into the distance. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the leaves in the breeze. But as the night deepened, something strange began to stir in the woods. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint rustling, like the soft stir of a distant animal. But then, from the valley below, came a sound unlike anything the campers had ever heard. A deep, mournful cry echoed through the mountains, carried on the wind. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the screech of any creature they knew. The cry was human, a desperate, sorrowful wail that seemed to echo the very essence of despair. The campers froze, exchanging uneasy glances. No one spoke at first, for fear that the sound would return. And then, as if summoned by their silence, it came again. A long, drawn-out cry that seemed to pierce the night itself. It echoed through the trees and reverberated in their bones. They shivered, unsure if it was the cry of someone lost or something far worse. As the night wore on, the cry grew closer, much too close for comfort. It seemed to drift in and out of hearing, sometimes muffled by the rustling of the leaves, sometimes chillingly clear. The fire flickered erratically, as if struggling against the unseen forces around them. One by one, the campers retreated into their tents, pulling the fabric tight as though it could shield them from whatever haunted the night. They whispered nervously to each other, their voices barely rising above the whispers of the wind. But as the hours passed, the cry did not cease. Instead, it grew louder, more persistent, as if something or someone was drawing nearer. Their hearts pounded, and a dreadful unease settled over them like a dark fog. A few of the braver souls ventured out, flashlights trembling in their hands, but each time they found nothing. No trace of the source of the cry, no sign of life in the valley. As dawn began to break, the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The mountains, which had once seemed so welcoming, now felt cold and unyielding. When the campers finally emerged from their tents, they found the valley bathed in a pale, ghostly light. But there was something wrong. One of their own was missing. The tents were in disarray, and belongings were scattered around as though someone had fled in a hurry. Their missing friend, Daniel, had simply vanished. No trace of him remained. The others searched the area frantically, calling his name, but the only response was the wind whispering through the trees, carrying with it an eerie echo of the cry they had heard the night before. The remaining campers were shaken to their core, their nerves frayed from fear and lack of sleep. They did not speak of the cry, for none of them could find the words to explain what had happened. They packed up their gear quickly, their movements rushed, as though something unseen was watching them from the shadows. It wasn't until much later, when they returned to civilization, that the full weight of the horror struck them. Daniel's body was never found, and though the authorities searched the woods for weeks, no trace of him was ever discovered. The only thing they could not explain was the strange, mournful wail that could be heard from the mountains whenever the wind picked up. The others, too, were never quite the same. The memory of the cry haunted them, following them in their dreams, echoing in their minds whenever they found themselves alone. They would never return to those woods, for they knew, deep down, that the cry of the lost one was a warning, and a memory that would never fade. And as for Daniel, the one who vanished, the woods held a secret they would never reveal. But the cry, it still echoed through the valley, waiting for the next lost soul to hear its mournful call. Story number 2. The Shadow in the Fog. In a secluded part of the forest, far from the paths that most travelers took, there was a place where the trees grew thick and the ground was soft with moss. It was a place untouched by civilization, quiet and serene. At least it seemed that way during the day. But as night fell, something strange began to happen. Each evening, a dense fog would roll in from the valley, creeping over the land like an impenetrable veil, swallowing everything in its path. The campers who had set up their tents in the heart of the woods had heard the stories of the fog. It was said that the mist was not just a natural phenomenon, but something older, something that had lingered in the forest for centuries, carrying with it the whispers of those who had vanished. The group had not believed the stories at first. They laughed it off, settling in around their campfire, their voices ringing out in the crisp night air. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows across the clearing. But as the hours passed, the warmth of the fire began to fade, and the night grew cold and still. One by one, the campers fell asleep, wrapped in the comfort of their sleeping bags, unaware of the change that was slowly overtaking the forest. It was not until the middle of the night that they woke, stirred by a strange feeling in the air. At first, they thought it was nothing, just the rustling of the trees or the wind stirring the leaves. But then, something was different. The fire, once burning bright, had reduced to nothing but a handful of glowing embers. The air was thick with fog, so dense it seemed to swallow up everything in its path. The campers sat up, disoriented and confused. Their belongings, which had been neatly arranged around the camp, were now scattered across the ground, as though a violent wind had blown through the clearing. But there was no wind, just the fog, creeping in as silent and slow as death itself. At first, they dismissed it as the work of an animal, perhaps a bear or a large raccoon, moving through their camp during the night. They reassured themselves with these thoughts, trying to push away the unease that had settled in their stomachs. But then, a figure appeared through the fog. At first, it was nothing more than a dark shape, a silhouette barely visible against the gray mist. But as it drew closer, the campers could see that it was no animal. It was a figure, tall and thin, its outline shifting and flickering like smoke. It moved with an unnatural speed, gliding through the fog as if it were part of it, its movements swift and fluid, far too fast for any living creature. The campers froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't even human. The figure drew closer still, until it was within mere feet of the campfire. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by the fog, but its presence was unmistakable. A coldness radiated from it, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on everything around it. The campers could feel their breaths catch in their throats, their bodies trembling as the figure lingered at the edge of the camp, watching them. For a long moment, there was silence, only the sound of their ragged breathing and the crackling of the dying fire. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing back into the fog as quickly as it had come. The campers didn't speak for several moments. They were paralyzed with fear, unable to process what they had just seen. They tried to convince themselves that it was a trick of the light, or perhaps their minds playing games with them in the dark. But deep down, they knew the truth. There were things in the fog, things that had once been human. The campers hurriedly packed up their belongings, their hands shaking as they tried to gather their scattered equipment. The fog seemed to close in around them, thick and suffocating, as though it were alive, watching, waiting. They made their way through the forest, desperate to escape the mist and the dark figure that had appeared from it. But no matter how fast they moved, they could not shake the feeling that they were being followed. The fog, it seemed, had its own will, and it was not done with them yet. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the fog had lifted, vanishing as mysteriously as it had come. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a cold, silvery light over the clearing. The campers paused, their hearts still racing, but the forest was silent once again. They had escaped, at least for now, but none of them ever returned to that part of the forest. The shadow in the fog, whatever it was, had marked them, and they knew it would never forget their faces. And so, the fog continued to roll in each night, thick and impenetrable, hiding things that watched from within, things that had once been human. Story number 3. The Old Path. There are places in this world, hidden away from the eyes of most, that seem to carry with them a deep, unnatural stillness. One such place lay deep within the woods, far from the paths known to most travelers. It was a place where few dared to venture, and those who did often returned with strange stories, whispers of a forgotten path, cursed and twisted, leading into the heart of the forest. A lone camper named Thomas had heard the stories from the locals at a small town nearby. They spoke in hushed tones about the old path, warning him that it was not a place for a wanderer seeking peace. "The dead walk there," they said. "The land itself is poisoned by the tragedy of those who died long ago." But Thomas, seeking nothing more than solitude and the thrill of exploring an untouched part of the forest, could not resist the temptation. With only his backpack and a flashlight, he set out one morning, the sun barely above the horizon. The air was cool and fresh, and the path ahead seemed inviting, though it quickly grew narrow and overgrown with thick vines and tangled roots. He pushed on, each step deeper into the shadows of the trees. The forest around him felt strangely quiet, as if it too was holding its breath, watching him move deeper into its heart. As the day passed and the sun began to sink lower, Thomas felt a strange sense of unease. He had expected the forest to be quiet, but this was different. There were no sounds of birds or animals, not even the wind rustling through the leaves. The only noise was the faint crunch of his boots on the forest floor and the occasional creak of distant trees. Still, he pressed forward, driven by a mixture of curiosity and a sense that the path was calling to him, urging him to continue. Soon, the path twisted sharply, turning sharply to the right and descending into a hollow in the earth. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining above, blocking out what little light was left. The air grew heavier, colder. It was as if the earth itself was damp with a sorrow long forgotten. Then, as nightfall descended upon the forest, Thomas saw it. A clearing up ahead, shrouded in mist. The faint outline of stones appeared in the fog, and with a sense of foreboding, he stepped forward. The ground underfoot felt wrong, hollow somehow, as if the earth itself was unsettled. When he stepped into the clearing, he realized where he had arrived. A forgotten graveyard, hidden for years from the eyes of the living. The gravestones were old, weathered by time and neglect, but even so, they stood tall, their inscriptions barely readable. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the fog hung low, crawling between the stones like a living thing. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around. He could not understand how he had ended up here, or why the path had led him to this forsaken place. But before he could turn back, he felt a coldness settle over him. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he turned to leave, but his feet refused to move. The earth beneath him seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, as if it was alive. It was then that he heard it, a soft rustling, like the sound of something moving through the undergrowth. It was faint at first, but it grew louder until the ground itself seemed to tremble with each step. And then, from the mist, figures began to appear, shadows that moved with unnatural grace. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes empty, staring through Thomas as if they could see his very soul. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs were frozen, his body trapped by the weight of the past that clung to the graveyard. The figures came closer, their footsteps silent, their cold hands reaching for him. And as they drew near, Thomas felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a chill that seeped into his bones. "Leave this place," a voice whispered, ancient and hollow. "The dead do not rest here." The earth beneath Thomas's feet seemed to shift, and he realized that the dead did not sleep in this graveyard. They lingered, cursed to walk the earth for eternity. He turned to run, but it was too late. The fog closed in around him, the figures closing in on all sides. When dawn broke, the fog lifted, and the forest was still once again. But there was no sign of Thomas. The path remained, winding through the woods, but the old graveyard had vanished, as though it had never been there at all. Only the wind carried the whispers of the dead, warning any who dared to stray too far from the main trail. And so, the old path remained, forgotten by most, but ever present for those who sought to uncover its secrets, and for those who, like Thomas, would never return. Story number 4. The Whispering Trees. A young couple, Sarah and Mark, had been looking forward to their camping trip for weeks. They had chosen an isolated forest, far away from the bustle of daily life, hoping for a peaceful retreat into nature. The forest was untouched, wild and tranquil, with towering trees stretching high into the sky and the air thick with the scent of pine. It was the perfect place to escape and reconnect with each other, or so they thought. They set up camp near a small stream, where the sound of rushing water blended with the rustling leaves overhead. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they gathered firewood and prepared a meal, talking and laughing under the fading light. The evening was calm, with only the occasional chirp of crickets or the distant hoot of an owl breaking the silence. But as night fell and the darkness enveloped the camp, something began to feel off. The wind, which had been light and pleasant earlier, picked up, whistling through the trees. Sarah was the first to notice it, a faint sound that seemed to come from deep within the woods. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the call of an animal. This was different. It was a whispering, low and unintelligible, as if the trees themselves were speaking. At first, they dismissed it as a trick of the mind. The wind, after all, could make all sorts of strange noises when it moved through the branches. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Words seemed to emerge from the rustling leaves, calling out their names. Sarah. Mark ... The voices were soft at first, like a murmur in the distance, but they grew clearer with each passing moment. It wasn't the wind anymore. These were deliberate, almost familiar voices, beckoning them deeper into the forest. Sarah shuddered, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark looked at her confused. "It's just the wind, probably just some animals nearby." But the whispers did not cease. Instead, they seemed to grow more urgent, more insistent. Sarah. Mark ... The voices were closer now, and they sounded like they were coming from the trees themselves. As if the branches were speaking, each whisper brushing against their ears. Unable to ignore it any longer, the couple stood up and walked cautiously toward the source of the sound, their feet crunching in the dry leaves. The trees around them were thick, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, the wind carrying the voices in all directions, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Suddenly, Mark stopped. His eyes widened with fear. "Sarah, look," he whispered, pointing ahead. There, in the clearing, stood a row of ancient trees, tall and imposing, their bark dark and scarred. But it wasn't just the trees that made Mark's blood run cold, it was the way they moved. The branches, thick and gnarled, twisted and shifted as if alive, bending and swaying in an unnatural rhythm, even though the wind had died down. The whispers had turned into voices, low and mournful, each word piercing their minds like a knife. "Leave, now, before it's too late." The couple turned to run, but the moment they stepped away from the trees, they heard a rustling behind them. The trees were following them, no longer rooted to the ground, but shifting, slowly gliding toward them, their branches reaching out like fingers. Panic gripped their hearts and they ran faster, the air thick with the sound of whispering leaves. But no matter how fast they moved, the trees were always just behind them, closing the distance with impossible speed. Sarah could feel her chest tightening with each breath. The trees were not just chasing them. They were watching, waiting for them to fall into their grasp. And with each step, something else began to happen. The memories, once clear and vivid, started to slip away. Sarah couldn't remember how long they had been running, or when the last time she had seen Mark clearly. His face was starting to blur in her mind, as though his very image was being erased. And worse, she couldn't remember where they had set up camp or why they were in the forest in the first place. It was as if the trees were pulling their memories away, one by one, erasing the very essence of who they were. By the time dawn broke and the first light of morning filtered through the trees, only Sarah remained. She was standing in the same place, breathless and disoriented, but Mark was gone. She couldn't remember if she had seen him fall or if he had simply disappeared into the mist. All she knew was that the forest around her was still, the trees motionless once again. Her mind was a haze of confusion. She felt as though she had never been a part of this world, as if she had never truly existed. The whispering trees had taken not just her memories, but her very identity. She stood in the clearing, wondering if she had ever truly been human at all. And in the distance, the trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind, as though nothing had ever happened. Story number 5. The Campground of the Damned. A group of friends, eager to escape the routine of daily life, decided to spend the weekend at a remote campground far from the distractions of the city. It was a well-known spot among locals, nestled deep in the woods, but not many ventured there due to its isolation. Still, they had heard of its beauty, the towering trees, the quiet lakeside, and the stillness of nature. It seemed like the perfect place to relax and unwind. As they set up camp on a small patch of land beside the lake, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of pine and the sound of birds calling to one another. The group of friends, 4 in total, were excited, chatting and laughing as they unpacked their gear. They built a fire and settled around it, sharing stories and joking as the night began to creep in. But as darkness settled over the campground, an unsettling feeling crept over them. At first, they dismissed it as nothing more than nerves, the kind of tension that comes with being in the woods at night. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed in the silence. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, like the light tread of someone moving through the underbrush. At first, they thought it was one of them, but as the sound grew louder, they realized no one had moved from their circle around the fire. They looked at each other, uneasy, as the footsteps seemed to grow closer and closer. Each footfall was crisp and deliberate, like someone was walking around them in the darkness, just out of sight. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked. his voice barely above a whisper. "It's probably an animal," said Lucy, trying to brush it off. But her eyes darted nervously to the tree line. The footsteps continued, but no one appeared in the darkness. No rustling of leaves, no breaking of branches. Just the steady, rhythmic sound of someone walking, someone who was not visible. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "We should check it out," said James, trying to sound confident. But as they rose from their seats and moved toward the edge of the camp, the footsteps stopped, dead silent. A stillness fell over the area, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The group spent the next hour searching the perimeter of the camp, but there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of movement, only the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze. They returned to the fire, their nerves on edge, trying to convince themselves that it was just their imaginations running wild. But then, the voices began. Soft whispers, faint but distinct, drifted from the woods around them. It wasn't a language they could understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, desperate, filled with a strange sorrow. The voices seemed to come from all directions at once, and though the group called out into the woods, no one answered. "Let's go," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this." But just as quickly as the voices had appeared, they fell silent, leaving only the crackling of the fire to fill the void. The group huddled together, too unnerved to sleep, but too tired to leave. They stayed close, watching the shadows around them, waiting for something, anything, to happen. By morning, everything was eerily calm. The sun rose over the treetops, casting golden light on the campground. But the peace was short-lived. As they began to pack up their belongings, they realized something was wrong. One of them was missing. Mark was gone. They searched the area frantically, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His tent was empty, his sleeping bag undisturbed. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The others were terrified, but they couldn't understand what had happened. They hadn't heard him leave. They hadn't seen anyone move during the night. And then, as they searched the trees around their camp, they found something even stranger. Strange symbols had appeared on the trunks of the trees. The markings were crude, like something carved hastily with a sharp object. They were ancient-looking, a mixture of lines and circles, but the patterns were unmistakably unnatural. The friends tried to make sense of them, but the symbols felt wrong, evil even. It was as if they were a warning, or a mark of something far darker than they could comprehend. When the local sheriff arrived, he did not seem surprised. He had seen things like this before, he told them. There were rumors in the town, old stories passed down through generations about the campground and its dark history. He spoke of campers who had disappeared over the years, vanished without a trace. It was said that there was a force in the woods, a presence that claimed the living in the dead of night. Some believed it was a curse, a malevolent spirit tied to the land, while others whispered of something even worse, something ancient that had never truly left. As the sheriff led the group back to the town, he gave them one last warning. Don't come back. The forest doesn't forget, and neither does the thing that lives within it. The group never returned to that campground, but they could never forget the footsteps, the voices, or the sight of those strange symbols on the trees. And though they tried to move on with their lives, there was always a nagging feeling, one that told them the force in the woods was still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to set up camp on the grounds of the damned. Story number 6. The Blood Moon Ritual. A group of friends had set out on a camping trip in a secluded valley, far from the busy roads and bright lights of the city. They sought adventure and a break from their routine, eager to explore the deep, untouched woods that stretched for miles around. The valley, with its towering trees and quiet streams, felt like a place lost in time. A perfect spot to escape the world for a few days. On the second evening of their trip, while walking along the edge of a dense forest, they stumbled upon something unexpected. A stone circle, ancient and weathered by time. The stones were large, rough-hewn, and arranged in a perfect circle, though the ground around them had been overgrown with ivy and moss. At first, the friends admired the mystery of the site, impressed by its age and beauty. But as they stepped closer, they began to notice strange symbols carved into the stones. Symbols that seemed foreign and unexplainable, their meaning lost to time. "Look at these," Sarah said, tracing one of the markings with her fingers. "These aren't just random carvings. They look like some kind of writing." Tom, the most skeptical of the group, shook his head. "It's probably just some old stuff left by travelers. People carve things into rocks all the time." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The symbols were too intricate, too deliberate to be random. They seemed to pulse with an energy that was hard to ignore, as if they held a secret that the stones were guarding. As the day turned to dusk, the friends decided to make camp near the stone circle. The moon was just beginning to rise above the horizon, casting a pale, cold light across the land. The air was still, heavy with the scent of earth and leaves, and the only sound was the crackling of their campfire. It wasn't long before the moon took on an unusual hue, glowing a deep red, what the locals would call a blood moon. The friends gathered around the fire, uneasy, as the moon seemed to grow larger in the sky, casting a strange, otherworldly light over everything. And then, something began to happen. As they sat together, chatting and trying to brush off the eerie feeling settling in the air, their friend Adam suddenly stood up, his face pale and his eyes wide. He muttered something, but it wasn't in English. It was a strange language, the words guttural and unfamiliar, as though they had come from a place far beyond their understanding. "Adam, what's wrong with you?" Tom asked, his voice laced with concern. Adam's eyes locked onto them, but there was something different about his gaze. Cold, empty, and distant. His lips moved again, speaking words none of them could recognize. The language sounded ancient, like the murmurings of something from the deep past, and with each passing second it seemed to grow more intense, more desperate. Sarah stood up and took a step toward Adam. "This isn't funny, Adam. Stop it." But Adam didn't respond. His body began to tremble, and then, with an unnatural speed, he ran toward the stone circle. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like someone, or something, was controlling him. The friends followed, calling his name, but by the time they reached the circle, Adam had stopped in the center, his body stiff and rigid. The blood moon above them bathed everything in its eerie red glow, and for a moment, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Then, to their horror, the ground beneath their feet trembled. The stones of the circle began to vibrate, their carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. A deep, rumbling sound came from below the earth, like something ancient was waking from its long slumber. The friends froze, their hearts pounding in their chests as they watched, helpless, as Adam's body began to change. His eyes grew wide, the pupils dilating to unnatural sizes, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. It was as if the very earth had claimed him, pulling him into the circle as though he was a sacrifice to something older than time itself. The ground beneath the stone circle split open with a terrible cracking sound, and from the earth's depths, something dark and monstrous began to rise. It was like nothing they had ever seen, its form shifting and undulating, a creature of shadows and nightmares. It had no distinct shape, only the faint outline of twisted limbs and a face that seemed to flicker like smoke. The air around them grew cold, and the creature's presence seemed to suck the very warmth from their bodies. "Run!" Tom screamed, grabbing Sarah's arm, but it was too late. The creature's shape shifted again, moving with a speed and force that no living thing should possess. It reached out toward them, its shadowy limbs stretching toward the group. One by one, the friends ran, but they could feel it, something pulling at their minds, like invisible tendrils tugging them back toward the stone circle. They could hear Adam's voice now, distorted and hollow, calling to them from the depths of the earth. It was as if the blood moon had unlocked something that had been buried beneath the stone circle for centuries, waiting for its time to rise. When they reached the edge of the forest, gasping for breath, the creature was gone, swallowed back into the earth. The ground was still once more, and the moon had returned to its normal state. But the friends knew they had witnessed something far beyond their understanding. Adam was gone. And in the days that followed, the friends found no trace of him, no sign of his presence, only the stone circle, now silent and still, its strange symbols etched into the rock, waiting for the next blood moon to rise. The legend of the ritual sacrifice, passed down through generations of locals, had come to life that night. And the blood moon, once a harbinger of doom, had claimed its price. Awakened by the ancient markings, the ritual was complete. The earth had claimed what it was owed, and nothing would be the same again. Story number 7. The Vanishing Lake. A group of friends had been looking forward to their camping trip for months. They had heard stories of a secluded lake deep within the forest, a picturesque spot surrounded by tall trees and peaceful nature. It was a favorite destination for campers who sought solitude and beauty, and the group eagerly made their way to the lake, hoping for a weekend of escape from their busy lives. The lake was everything they had imagined. The water was clear and still, reflecting the towering trees that circled its edges. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the scene, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. They set up their tents on the shore, content to be so far from the world they knew. As night fell, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. But something felt off. The lake, which had been so serene during the day, now appeared unnervingly still, as if the water itself were frozen in time. There was no ripple, no movement, nothing to suggest that the lake was alive. The stillness of the water seemed unnatural, as if something beneath the surface was waiting, watching. "Maybe it's just a calm night," Sarah said, trying to dismiss the strange feeling creeping over her. "Yeah," said Jake, forcing a smile. "It's just the quiet. This place is meant to be peaceful, right?" But as the night deepened, an uneasy silence settled over them. The sound of the wind in the trees was the only thing that broke the stillness, and even that seemed distant, muffled. The campers sat around the fire, trying to push aside the growing sense of dread that gnawed at them. The lake, though beautiful, now seemed like something distant and cold, a place untouched by time or life. As they sat, the water began to stir, slowly at first, as though something beneath it was shifting. The campers exchanged wary glances, their unease growing with every passing moment. The water rippled, then swelled, as though something large was moving just beneath the surface. No one spoke. They all watched in silence, mesmerized by the unnatural movement of the lake. The night grew darker, the stars barely visible behind the thick canopy of trees. The campers heard a strange sound then, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. The ground trembled lightly, as if the lake itself was alive, awakening from some deep, ancient slumber. Suddenly, the water began to rise, slowly at first, then more quickly, as though it had no intention of stopping. The campers stood up in alarm as the lake began to creep toward their campsite, its surface growing higher and higher. The fire, once crackling warmly, was quickly consumed by the rising water, casting strange, flickering shadows across the shore. "Get the gear! The lake's flooding!" shouted Tom, his voice tinged with panic. But it was too late. The water surged over the shoreline, rushing into their camp with terrifying speed. In moments, their belongings were swallowed by the lake, and the campers were forced to flee. The trees seemed to close in around them as they scrambled up the bank, away from the rising water. They ran, but the lake kept rising, as if the very earth beneath them was being swallowed whole. The water churned and swirled, the surface thick with something dark, something they couldn't understand. The lake seemed to be alive, angry, determined to reclaim everything in its reach. By dawn, the lake had stopped rising. The sky was still dark, and the camp was gone, swallowed by the water. The campers gathered at the edge of the lake, but when they looked down at the water's edge, they saw something even stranger. The lake was gone. In its place was a vast, empty plain, the ground dry and cracked, as though the very earth had been drained. There were no signs of the camp, no signs of the water that had flooded the area only hours before. It was as if the lake had never existed, as though it had been erased from the world entirely. But something was wrong. One of the campers, Jake, was missing. They searched the plain, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. As they looked around, they realized with a creeping horror that there were no tracks, no signs of anything having been there. It was as though the lake, the camp, the water, and the people had all been swallowed up by the earth, leaving only emptiness in their wake. Hours passed, and the sense of dread deepened. The group tried to make sense of what had happened, but they couldn't. The lake, the water, the rising flood, it had all been so real, so terrifying. And yet now it seemed like a nightmare, fading before their eyes. Then, as they gathered near the center of the plain, a figure appeared in the distance. It was Jake, or at least, it looked like him. But as he stumbled toward them, his eyes wide and vacant, his face twisted in a look of utter madness. They knew something was wrong. He was not the same person who had left camp the night before. "I saw it," he muttered, his voice a broken whisper. "I saw them, down there, in the water. I heard them, calling me." Jake's mind had shattered, and he was now a shadow of the person they had known. He had seen something beneath the lake, something ancient and terrible that had broken his mind. The group tried to reach out to him, to bring him back, but the madness in his eyes was too strong. He had seen the lake's true nature, and it had consumed him. By the time they left the plain, only one camper remained, Sarah. The others had vanished, their minds lost in the madness of the lake's depths. Sarah was the only one left to tell the tale, the only one who knew what lay beneath the surface, waiting for those foolish enough to camp near the vanishing lake. But she could never forget the look in Jake's eyes, the madness that had taken him. And as she walked away from the empty plain, she knew, deep in her heart, that the lake was still out there, waiting to claim anyone who dared to return. Story number 8, The Trapper's Cabin. A group of adventurers, all friends and thrill-seekers, had set out for a week-long camping expedition deep in the heart of an untouched forest. They were eager to explore the wilderness, to hike through rugged terrain, and experience the isolation of nature. The journey had been long and tiring, but the group was in good spirits, enjoying the beauty of the forest and the camaraderie of being together. On the 4th day of their trip, they found something unexpected. A small weathered cabin tucked away in a clearing, hidden from view by the dense trees. It was an odd sight. The cabin appeared abandoned, yet somehow well preserved. The wooden walls, though cracked and aged, still stood firm, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to enter. Curious and eager to explore, the group approached cautiously. It was strange to find a cabin so deep in the woods, far from any known trail or settlement. As they stepped inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of age and dust. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, with a simple wooden table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace that looked as though it hadn't been used in years. On the walls were hunting trophies, antlers, furs, and animal skulls. A feeling of loneliness hung heavy in the room, as if the cabin had been abandoned long ago, yet left untouched by time. They moved further into the space, their footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors, until they came across a small desk against the far wall. On the desk lay a weathered journal, its leather cover cracked with age. One of the adventurers, Peter, picked it up, his fingers brushing over the faded pages. The handwriting inside was sharp and hurried, as though the writer had been in a constant state of anxiety. As he read aloud, the others gathered around. The journal belonged to a trapper who had lived alone in the cabin for many years, surviving off the land and his hunting. But the entries grew darker as the days went on, speaking of strange occurrences in the woods, whispers on the wind, shadows moving where there should be none, and the feeling of being watched. The trapper had written of hearing footsteps behind him when he was alone in the forest, footsteps that were never his own. He spoke of something unseen, something that moved in the trees just beyond his sight. As the entries progressed, the trapper's writing became more erratic, more desperate. He spoke of seeing eyes watching him from the darkness, eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. And then there were the last few pages where his handwriting was almost unreadable, frenzied and broken. He wrote of being hunted, of something terrible in the woods that would not let him leave. Peter closed the journal with a shiver. "This is unsettling," he said, his voice low. The group fell silent, each of them feeling the weight of the trapper's words hanging in the air. Night fell quickly, as it always does in the forest, and the group decided to stay in the cabin. They built a small fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. But as the night deepened, a strange feeling settled over them. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt oppressive, like it was holding its breath. It started with the faint sound of footsteps, light, almost imperceptible, as if someone, or something, was moving just beyond the walls of the cabin. The adventurers tried to ignore it, brushing it off as the wind or the creaking of the old wood. But as the hours passed, the footsteps grew clearer, more distinct, as if someone was walking just outside, pacing around the cabin. Then, one of them, Lisa, turned pale. She was staring at the trapper's journal, which had somehow shifted position on the desk. The pages were open, but the writing seemed to move, to change, as though the words were shifting before their eyes. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Peter went to the journal, looking at the words. There was nothing unusual about them, but the feeling of dread had deepened. It was as if the cabin itself had come alive, and the air around them was thick with the presence of something unseen. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind howled through the cracks in the walls, extinguishing the fire and plunging the cabin into darkness. The footsteps outside stopped, and for a moment there was an eerie silence. But then, from somewhere deep within the cabin, they heard a sound, a soft, guttural whisper, too low to make out, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from all directions, as though the very walls were speaking. The group huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. They could feel the temperature drop, the air growing heavier, as if something was closing in on them. Then, one by one, they turned to look at the trapper's belongings, the tools scattered around the cabin. It was as if the trapper himself was still there, watching them. His eyes, which had once been lifeless in the journal's drawings, now seemed to follow them. No matter where they went in the cabin, those eyes were fixed upon them, unblinking, never leaving them. The whispers grew louder, and the footsteps outside began again, closer now. The group scrambled to the door, but when they tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the sound of movement outside the cabin grew louder and louder, as though something was pacing just beyond the reach of their sight. They could feel the presence of the trapper, his spirit, or whatever had remained of him, lingering in the cabin, watching them, waiting. And with each passing moment, they knew that they were no longer alone in the woods. By morning, the cabin was silent again. The fire was out and the footsteps had stopped. But the group knew what they had felt, what they had experienced. The trapper had not died in the usual way. He had been claimed by whatever haunted these woods, and now, it seemed, the same fate was waiting for them. They left the cabin at first light, never looking back, and the forest swallowed their footprints as if they had never been there. The trapper's cabin remained, silent and still, but the feeling of dread never left them, for they knew the woods had claimed yet another set of souls. And somewhere, deep within the trees, the trapper's eyes were still watching, waiting for the next visitors to stumble upon his home. Story number 9. The Haunted Ridge. A group of friends, eager for adventure and the beauty of nature, set off on a camping trip high in the mountains. They had heard of a place called the Haunted Ridge, known for its breathtaking views of the valley below. The ridge stretched out far and wide, with jagged rocks and steep cliffs that seemed to reach into the sky. The group, excited by the idea of camping at such a stunning location, decided to make the ridge their home for the night. The hike to the ridge was long and tiring, but the moment they reached the top, they were in awe. The view stretched out before them, rolling hills, distant rivers, and a sunset that painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. They set up their tents near the edge of the ridge, the cool mountain breeze brushing against their faces. The fire they built crackled brightly, and they laughed and shared stories as the sun dipped below the horizon. But as night fell, a strange feeling began to settle over them. The air grew colder, and the shadows from the trees and rocks seemed to stretch farther, creeping across the land in ways that didn't seem natural. The group, still trying to enjoy the evening, couldn't shake the unease that hung in the air. There was something wrong with the ridge, a heaviness, as if the land itself was watching them. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. It carried with it faint whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. They came in bursts like voices calling from the distance, but each word was unintelligible, lost in the wind. The friends looked around nervously, their smiles fading. "I think we should head to bed," said Mark, one of the more nervous members of the group. "This place feels strange." But before they could settle in for the night, something caught their attention. A flicker of movement along the ridgeline. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, as if something was moving there, just out of sight. The group fell silent, staring into the darkness. Was it just the wind? Or was something truly there? One by one, the group started to notice it. Figures moving in the shadows, shifting against the ridgeline. At first, they thought it was just their eyes playing tricks on them. But the shapes grew clearer, darker, more distinct. The figures moved with unnatural speed and grace, disappearing behind rocks and trees, only to reappear elsewhere, always just out of reach. "Did you see that?" whispered Emily, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the whispers on the wind grew louder, more insistent. The voices were clearer now, almost pleading, like someone calling their names, but the sound was distant, echoing from all directions. One of the group, Alex, stood up suddenly, his eyes wide with fear. "I need to see what that is," he muttered, his voice distant and empty. "Alex, don't go," Mark pleaded. But Alex was already walking toward the darkness, his steps slow and deliberate, as if something was pulling him toward it. "Alex, wait!" Emily shouted, but he didn't turn back. He simply disappeared into the night, swallowed by the shadows. The group was paralyzed with fear. They called for Alex, but their voices seemed to vanish into the wind. And then it happened again. One by one, they felt the pull, the irresistible force that drew them toward the ridgeline. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging them to follow. And one by one, each camper rose, entranced by the unseen force, and walked off into the dark. By the time dawn's first light broke over the ridge, only two remained, Mark and Emily. They were huddled together near the fire, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. They had seen the others vanish into the night, one after the other. They had called out for them, but there was no response. It was as if the ridge had swallowed them whole. Neither Mark nor Emily could explain what had happened. They remembered the whispers, the pull of the shadows, the way the land seemed to call to them, drawing them away from the safety of the camp. But they couldn't speak of what they had seen, or rather, what they hadn't seen. The shadows, the figures, the whispers, they were all real. And yet, when they tried to recall the faces of their missing friends, they were gone from their memory, as if the ridge itself had erased them. As the sun rose higher in the sky, they gathered their things in a daze, too afraid to stay another moment. They didn't speak to each other, too terrified to trust their own minds. The ridge, they knew, was not just haunted, it was something worse. It was hungry, always waiting for the next victim to wander too close to its edge, to be drawn into the darkness. They left the ridge behind, but the memory of that night would never leave them. The whispers still echoed in their minds, and the shadows lingered, watching them from the corners of their thoughts. The ridge had claimed its prize, and there was no way to know how many more would fall prey to its call. And so, the legend of the haunted ridge lived on, a place where the living dared not go, for the ridge was always waiting, always hungry for the next soul to be lost in the dark. Story number 10, The Moonlit Figure. It was a crisp autumn night when James, a lone camper, set up his tent under the glow of the full moon. The forest around him was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He had been hiking all day and was eager to rest, enjoying the solitude the woods provided. The sky was clear, and the moon shone brightly overhead, casting long shadows through the trees and bathing the camp in pale light. After a simple meal by the fire, James retired to his tent, the warmth of the campfire still lingering on his skin. He lay back on his sleeping bag, staring up at the canvas roof of the tent, trying to ignore the quiet sounds of the forest. Slowly, his eyelids grew heavy, and soon he fell into a deep sleep. But sometime later he awoke with a sudden start. The air around him was still, and the fire had burned down to embers, casting faint light on the surrounding trees. He felt an odd sensation, a sense that he wasn't alone. His heart raced, and he sat up in the dark, his breath shallow, straining to listen. From the corner of his eye, he saw it. Standing at the edge of his camp, just beyond the flickering shadows of the dying fire, was a figure. It was tall, draped in tattered robes that seemed to flutter lightly in the breeze, though no wind could be felt. The figure stood motionless, staring directly at James. Its face was hidden in the shadow of its hood, but James could feel its gaze, as if it were piercing through him. James's throat tightened in fear. He opened his mouth to call out, but no sound escaped his lips. He tried again, straining with all his might, but it was as if the air had thickened, pressing against him, muffling his voice. The figure did not move, its posture unnervingly still, like a statue waiting for something. James' mind raced. Who was this person? What were they doing here in the middle of the night, in the depths of the forest? Panic began to rise in his chest as he reached for his flashlight, but the beam of light flickered and died the moment he tried to turn it on. His hand trembled as he pulled the flashlight apart, but the bulb was burnt out, useless. The figure remained, its presence heavy in the stillness of the night. Time seemed to stretch, but it did not approach, nor did it retreat. It simply stood there, unmoving, watching him. James tried to calm himself, convincing himself that he was imagining things, that maybe it was just a trick of the light or the wind. But when he looked again, the figure was closer. It had not moved in any way that James could see, yet it now stood just at the edge of his camp, closer than before, as though it had simply drifted through the shadows. He felt his breath catch in his throat as a shiver ran down his spine. A terrible thought crossed his mind. What if it was not a person at all? What if it was something else? Something unnatural? His eyes darted nervously around the camp, searching for any sign of escape, but the forest seemed to press in around him, suffocating in its stillness. James couldn't take it any longer. He stood up, his legs shaky, and rushed to the edge of the camp ready to flee. But the moment he took a step forward, the figure seemed to shift in the moonlight, always remaining at the same distance, as though it were waiting for him to come closer. He stopped, frozen in place by a deep sense of dread. The figure was no longer just a distant observer. It was a presence, something far more ancient, far more patient than he could comprehend. The coldness of the night seemed to deepen around him, and his pulse hammered in his ears. For hours, the figure remained. James never slept again that night, unable to tear his eyes away from the tall, silent figure. As the night wore on, he could feel the pull of the moon, the way it hung in the sky like a silent witness to the figure's watchful presence. He felt as though the world itself had stopped, and only the figure remained, constant and unyielding. By the time dawn broke, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but an empty space where it had stood. The morning light revealed a scene of utter silence. No sign of the figure, no footprints, no traces of its presence remained. Yet James could feel it, the lingering sensation of being watched, as if the figure still hovered just beyond the edge of his perception. Days passed, but the memory of the figure stayed with him, a cold weight that never left his mind. He packed up and left the forest that morning, but the feeling of the figure's gaze, its silent, patient waiting, never truly faded. Months later, after returning home, James heard a chilling story from another camper, of a figure seen standing in the moonlight, watching silently as the night stretched on. The figure was described exactly as he had seen it, tall, draped in tattered robes, always waiting. And though no one else had ever disappeared, the legend grew. People spoke of the moonlit figure, a presence that waited under the full moon for someone to come too close. James never went back to those woods, but sometimes, when the moon was full and the night was still, he could feel the same weight of the figure's watchful gaze, waiting, ever patient, ever watchful.